I've learned that there are certain things that are more controversial than others. When I've said that I work in gender studies or on feminist philosophy to people who are not in academia, I usually get the question, is feminism still necessary? And I end up having to defend the kind of feminist political struggle for hours, and that's not something I want to do. Both you and I work in areas where we study marginalized people, and I mean, I've worked a lot with transgender people, and the fact that I'm not transgender myself is something that I constantly, I mean, I can be seen as that kind of outside onlooker that's trying to make something of transgender bodies that they're not. So I constantly have to defend why I'm the person who should be writing about this or thinking about this. And I think that's something that comes in, especially with studying disabilities and or what used to be called freak shows. I mean, it's always a difficult thing justifying why you are there as a scholar studying these things.
The imagining that you're speaking from some position of pure objectivity or impartiality is a myth about the way that we do research, or a myth about the way that we interpret things, that people like you and I spend a lot of time deconstructing or disassembling. So there are times when I don't necessarily want to have those conversations either. It's wearying to have conversations about the politics of feminism all the time. You know, there is times we think, I just can't be bothered having this conversation again, and yet it's part of, I think it's part of what we do in terms of thinking about part of the sort of responsible political positioning of our own research in terms of the objects of our study to do that work.
I completely agree. I actually think it's a responsibility we have to our community to be able to explain the implications of what we do, and to at least attempt to communicate the kind of discoveries we make, if we want to call them discoveries.
Yeah. Would debating a Holocaust denier only publicize their ideas, right? So would the effort that it took to definitively undermine and destroy the evidentiary basis of their arguments, you have to weigh that against publicizing the fact of Holocaust denial, right? This has always been the argument. Honestly, now, you know, where things don't proceed through official channels of information like newspapers or books or television shows, where people get their information from Twitter, and if they want to listen to Holocaust deniers or want to, you know, be aware of that kind of stuff, they can just do it. I think now, actually, the answer was probably, yeah, you should debate with these people. Do you know what I mean? Because they are being believed, right? In the post-truth kind of thing, they have an audience.
And I think it's about being cognizant of cultural behaviour, and that cultural behaviours include and they exclude. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that you won't have ardent nationalists who don't want people coming into Scotland, they don't want migration, that's everywhere. You know, it's endemic, it's not peculiar to Australia, it's not peculiar to Germany, you know, it's everywhere. And but I think we don't make for a better society if we don't discuss what the problems and fallacies are. And most of the time, the reasons people hold those views are socioeconomic. You know, they've been kicked down and bashed by society, they're excluded, they have no voice, you know, all that sort of stuff.
To riff on this a little bit. So one of the things that some of these identity politics movements, including the alt-right and whatnot, are offering is a sense of community. We share your values, we share your point of view, your worldview, your perspective, your problems, your you know, your key drivers, and so on and so forth. And it's like a club, and you know, and everybody can join. You put on a "Make America Great" a hat, you know, again, and wave banners. And that's a kind of a communal thing, and that, you know, it's part of what, you know, people are responding to is the lack of that.
Although I'm always really interested in thinking about the fact that academia has it is a kind of a self-contained world, but it's connected into communities. And I suppose, particularly I went to University of Tasmania to teach, which is a small state, and a lot of students there were first in family coming to university. Tasmania has a long history of people not going through to grade 12, let alone going to university. So it was often a really big thing for those students to be at university. And you know, the kinds of arguments about the ivory tower I thought really didn't work in a place like Tasmania. Teaching, I think, always makes you think, yes, there's the university world, but there's also this outside world. But also I've always liked arts and music, and I think, you know, those are worlds which connect into universities but are not the same kinds of institutions or set of questions necessarily. And so there's a lot of work I still do thinking about, you know, how the same sets of ideas might be explored in my academic work but might be explored in a visual artist's work, or, you know, performance artist's work, or theatre, or all sorts of other kinds of arts and creative fields.
So from some Indigenous perspectives, or many actually, many Indigenous perspectives, community it's not referred to as such, okay? It's more of a lived on, right? So it's enacted rather than mentioned. Professor Altimara Graham talks about the idea of reciprocity, okay, and relationality. If you start with understanding the world through ethics and not what things are, then that has a completely different type of relationship that you engage with people. So that sort of ethics is not in the backside of the driving seat of the way that people engage with the world, but in the driving seat. So you enact, in a sense, relationships through the way that you understand the world. So for instance, there is a flipping, for instance, of if I engage with nature in a particular way, okay, it will be very similar to the type of way that I would engage with people.
Yes, I think the term feminist has maybe a lot of bad connotations in the media, but I think it's important. I think it's important to define myself as a feminist. Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian author, was asked this question, and she answers it quite nicely. She's like, women have been oppressed and are oppressed all over the world, and so if we talk about ourselves as humanists, then we erase that oppression that's happened in multiple forms and in very different ways on different types of bodies, but it occurs and it's occurring. I mean, and it's occurring everywhere. So yeah, I have no problem identifying as a feminist.
In my thesis, what I was looking at was like this informal community of women who had been practicing this herbal medicine tradition, and through that had generated their own understandings of menstruation, of contraception, and of their own bodies, and kind of what was good for your body and what was not. And they often did not line up to what Western medicine considers good for a woman's like reproductive system. But what I found really interesting within that is that, especially in the case of New Order Indonesia, that there's a very, you know, heavy top-bottom kind of doctrine of like what should be known, what should be taught, what should be understood, and what should be done. And then there's actually what people know and what people do. And there's this gap there. I found it actually quite inspiring and comforting, knowing that women all throughout the world, all throughout different points in history, have always produced their own knowledge of their fertility and their reproduction in terms to take charge of that, especially in moments when ruling order has tried to really dictate what they do with their bodies, especially in terms of taking away contraceptive choices to women. That they're just example after example of communities of women figuring it out themselves and kind of subverting that dominant knowledge of how things should be done and figuring out a way that works for them, which I really enjoy that.
People have a sense of who they are, and they have a sense of the place that they belong in as they see it, and they have a sense of what the past has contributed to that place, what its amenity and qualities are. And these are all things that aren't created by human beings individually. They're done, collectively through a kind of community experience.
As a journalist, you are not important. The story is important. You need to be very wary of not bringing yourself into the narrative, and I suppose this shares similarities with social science research as well, where you need to kind of remove yourself and your own opinions and let the sources and the situation speak. I don't really think about the individual that much. It's more about what the contribution is back to society and how do we make a difference, because in the end, practice like journalism, as fraught as it is with poor practice and bad examples of where it's done the wrong thing, fundamentally it's concerned with improving, making a contribution to society. It's got a social responsibility aspect to it, a very strong one in fact, where it has a role in democracy and a role in informing societies. So for me, the social and the community aspect is incredibly important just by default. So while, say, I as an individual make judgments and decisions, and all that is embodied in the work that I produce, I think for me anyway, what is valuable is about what that other contribution can or might be.
One of the things that the research project I lead is actually looking at is the way that creativity is a communal activity, and it's so interesting. There's plenty of theorists who write about this in a lot more articulately than I do, but I see it because every book that comes into being through a sort of a network of people who are not collaborating, that's too explicit, but who help each other along the way and who open doors for each other, or who even discuss what things are working in a genre and what things might not work in a genre. And genre fiction is very, very good on this. The romance writing community is incredibly well networked. The fantasy writing community is incredibly well networked. And from these communities grow things like small press ventures and fanzines and opportunities for people to be creative. And even though they might be writing their stories individually at home in their pajamas or whatever, they're very much a product of a community orientation. So for me, creative writing and creativity in general is distributed across so many different hands. That to me makes a great deal of sense, the idea of community.
I guess that's the wonderful opportunity of doing a PhD, is that there's a rich opportunity for an extended period of time in the field. And so my fieldwork took me to regional Queensland and regional New South Wales and also rural New Zealand. But I spent about 2 years in the field. I'm one of those old-fashioned PhD students who spent far too long in the field and therefore took a long time to do my PhD. I think it was 5 years in total. But that gave me not just a taste for the richness of doing field work, but the vital role that building connection with community has in terms of ensuring that the research that we do is connected to the agendas that people have on the ground. And I think through that experience I became increasingly interested in doing research that could bring the voices of those whose interests and voices are often excluded from debates centre stage. I think that we often see that in the relation of global power relations, that particular voices are those that are loud. The loudest voices are the ones we hear a lot of, and often it's the voices of women, of Indigenous communities, not always of course, but often, that are sidelines, that particular experts speak for them but not with them. And so that has shaped the focus of my work. So building collaborations with community-based organisations, with non-government organisations, particularly environmental organisations, working collaboratively with traditional owner groups has become central to me, because I think it's a way that we can ensure that the research that we do is tied to the reality on the ground, that we bring the strong skill set, the methodologies that academia lends to us, that we bring social theory to better understand these social problems, but it's always connected to the kinds of challenges that communities face in the real world, so to speak.